Good evening, everybody. Well, good day from wherever you're listening to us from, and welcome to another session that we're having on Mental Health Awareness Month. Today, we're going to be talking about mental health and race, which is very important to us, and it's a topic that we usually don't dive into. And I have amazing guests with me. I have Cynthia and I have Neph. So, we're going to start our introduction. And Cynthia, do you mind introducing yourself and your racial or cultural background to the viewers, please?
Yes, absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Ogechi Cynthia Onyeka, and I am a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Loyola University Chicago. And with regards to my ethnic and racial background, I am Black, racially, but ethnically, I am Nigerian Ibo.
My name is Neph Lesperance. I am also Black, but my background, I guess my ethnic background is my family's Haitian. So my both my parents were born and raised in Haiti. Um, and funny enough, actually, I was born in Costa Rica with my sister. So we have a very unique background in that. But for the most part, I consider myself Haitian.
Oh wow. Okay. This is a diverse panel, guys. And I think I love the diversity. It brings a lot of experience with it. So I think I'll start with Cynthia and then we'll go to Neff with the next question. In your particular racial or cultural identity, how have you seen people address mental health? You said you are Igbo, so you're from Nigeria, right? In
Mhm.
the Nigerian community, how does it work? And I think maybe it's different when you are actually in Nigeria and when you find Nigerians who are in America, maybe because they've been kind of infused with the American culture. So I don't know if you can also speak a bit more on the differences on that and how mental health is handled like in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with the difference between those of us who live in like the diaspora
Mm,
versus Nigerians back home. But just from my experience, I was born in the US and I've lived in the United States, even though I've visited Nigeria many times. I think just across both domains, mental health is still strongly stigmatized. It's gotten better, especially with our generation, but it is stigmatized in the sense that often a lot of the things that I would qualify as a mental health concern are like written off as, well, a lot of people are stressed. You're not the only person who's stressed, or you need to pray about it. A lot of us are religious, whether it be Christian or Muslim, so it's like something that you have to do in a spiritual sense to address your concerns. And then other things related to even just not even being able to focus. It's kind of more up to the individual on their level of perseverance as opposed to things that have to do with mental health. But I will say I have noticed a lot of changes, especially in the last like 20 years with mental health awareness. And there's a lot of people doing the work back home, different organizations that are making mental health more aware. So it's great to see that change for sure. But there's still, I feel like, a long way to go.
mm. And I like the way you're talking about that days now we're starting to see the change. It's coming slowly but surely. But also how you kind of touch on if you bring maybe and say, hey, I'm stressed, and it's like, hey, you're not the only person who's stressed, or how I for me, I guess I admire how Nigerians are very religious. You guys love your faith. I love it. And you guys are very identity based. You keep your identity wherever you go. I will never meet a Nigerian in any other country and find them as the people that are there. They are always true to themselves, which is really great and speaks highly of you guys. So I don't know if Neff wants to speak to us a bit on your side. How have you seen, good or bad, people handle mental health in your cultural or racial background?
Yeah, I think very similar to what Cynthia described. Um, Mental health is not really something that is discussed that much, especially like in Haiti itself. I think, it seems like there's a little bit of change, but I know from like my parents just hearing how they talk about mental health, even though they work in a mental health facility, they still have a hard time wrapping their minds around some mental health, even especially if it's just like, depression or anxiety. If they see you with somebody with schizophrenia, obviously, like you can't really deny that because a lot of the symptoms are like right there in front of you. You can't be like, oh no, it's something else. Like it's right there. But some of the other ones, like, anxiety and depression, where you may not see like maybe all of the symptoms like right in front of you in the same way. It's very easy for them to be dismissive and be like, oh no, like, it's not, this is not real. They need to pray more. They need to do this and this and that. So it is very interesting to see. But then I know for me as well, like a lot of my friends who are Haitian, and are, in this younger like maybe like the millennials and, and younger, there's a lot of us that are like, yeah, we are going to therapy, we're okay with working this out and trying to figure out a different path forward. So I think we're a little bit more open. And of course, like, this is general, like, there's always exception to these rules. But that's usually what I see too. It's a lot of it is just like, go pray about it, go read your Bible, you're fine. Or maybe you just need something to do, type of thing. But it's never like, let's, sit with the fact that you might have a mental health concern. um and I would say too, like, I worked in inpatient for a little bit, and I saw a lot of like very hard and extreme cases. And one case I did work with, a Haitian family, and unfortunately, the wife of the family, she had schizophrenia, and she was on medication for a bit. And then when she started feeling better, they took her off of it because they were just like, well, it's fine. Let's just take you off. So because they did that, her symptoms came back, and then we had to go through the whole process. So even in some of this, it's like, um it's very hard for them to like really want to stick to the regimen that they're supposed to do, because I think they're still working through mental health and what that really means sometimes. So yeah, I think that's, in a nutshell, it's very similar to Nigerian culture, probably. So yeah.
Thank you for that. So I just want to bring, before we go to the next question, I've just been thinking of, if I should say, it sounds almost like tough love type of thing, or just man up type of reaction. Um, I guess I will start with Cynthia, and then we can go to Neph. Would you say that our history has kind of built that mentality in us, that we've never really? Because I think if we look at ourselves in our history, when you're going through such tough situations where we've seen of slavery and we've heard of poverty and we've had so many wars happen, myself in Congo as well, where we have war, and you just think of these things where you don't have that time to really feel depressed or stressed or anything. Otherwise, it might weigh you down and you might stop living altogether. And that the only result they could ever give a person is, hey, just keep going. Just keep moving. No matter what happens, keep moving, bottle it all up, man up, and everything will get okay, or everything will be okay. Do you think that that's, for me, I think that's probably most of the things that we've carried with us. We've just known it as, it's going to get better, just keep working, just keep moving, and we've never had that time to kind of say that I am weak, or to accept our weaknesses. I guess that's how I see it. So my question would be, if you agree with this kind of way, would you say that in a way it has helped us, or would you say it has destroyed us? I think I'll start with Cynthia, and then we'll go to Nep. Do you think this mentality of saying, hey, just man up, or just, I guess, just pray about it, or sometimes people not caring about it, that makes you toughen up a bit? Because I think some people can bring that up as an excuse and say, hey, my mom didn't care about that, and I toughened up, and I was able to get through it. So would you say that has kind of helped us or destroyed us in a way? So I think we'll start with Cynthia, and then we'll go to Neff.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think context is important, and that's what you're bringing up, like the context of our history, especially in Nigeria. Like, if you talk to any Nigerian, they'll let you know that we're not weak-minded people. Like, we're strong people. Like, we don't, that type of stuff doesn't bother us, because we're able to get through it, just like our ancestors were able to too. And I think all that has to do with coping. We've just been able to cope with it, and I think there are adaptive ways of coping that are helpful, which are kind of seen in a lot of the strengths that our community has, like, social support, reliance on family, strong cultural ties. Like, those are adaptive coping approaches and methods that we've used as a people. But there also can be some maladaptive ones that I think are kind of what you've been alluding to, like the avoidance of the reality of how we're feeling because we have to man up, or denying these feelings, invalidating. Like those are all just coping, and those can have negative outcomes. But at the same time, I don't blame us for having those maladaptive coping mechanisms because of the trauma that has been pushed upon our people because of imperialism and colonialism, and the hardship and the corruption in our government that has lasted through to this day, that has, caused people to adapt with it in this way. So, as people, we adapt to everything. So I think there's ways that are helpful, and there are ways that are not helpful. And some of the things that can create mental health stigma, those are, I feel like, are like maladaptive coping skills and mechanisms.
Yeah, wow. Great answer. Neph, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I definitely agree with what Cynthia said. Because I even think about like all the trauma and stuff that, if I think about Haiti, the context of Haiti, they had to go through slavery. They finally got out of slavery, and then they're like paying back their captors, and then there's always a hurricane. There's always civil unrest. I feel like it's just a giant pool of PTSD sometimes, not to mention the anxieties of, can I feed my family, probably depression. Like there's just so much stuff. And so I think sometimes as Black people, because we're put in those types of situations often, we never really have a chance to like sit in our grief and our sadness and like actually work through them. It's always like, I have to put this off because I need to, feed my family. I need to put this off because I have to survive. And so I know one of the things that me and one of my best friends talk about all the time is like how privileged we are that we can sit in therapy and we can, take time and really feel our feelings and talk about our feelings, because like most of our families before us didn't have that privilege. They were just trying to survive. And I think, even in thinking about, the United States context too now, um, as I'm learning more and more about US history, because it happens to be something that's interesting to me, especially because I'm trying to do work in anti racism. Every day I'm reading something else, I'm enraged. And so for me, thinking about that and thinking about the United States context, I am always like, wow, like it must take so much for African Americans to, know all the violence and all the things that their families have gone through over the generations and not be as enraged. And then also to figure out how do I cope with the depression that comes with constantly being in generational poverty, or the traumas that come with living in these types of conditions, or even the trauma of, I mean, how many hashtags and say my names and all that stuff do we have to keep walking through? And for us, like, who are younger, it might have been like 20 years of this maybe, because I think I finally started paying attention to say your name stuff maybe in the 2000s. So maybe I was like 20. So maybe 10 years of that for me. But there's some other people that have been dealing with this way longer. And so to think about the trauma, the depression, the anxieties, all these things that might be coming up for them that they don't have the opportunity to sit with it's really crazy to think about. And I was talking to Cynthia a little bit even today about how even like when we think about, who's in the Zoom room right now, like we're Black women too. So as Black women, a lot of Black women, we don't have the luxury of sitting in our grief because we're making sure that our kids are okay. We're making sure that our spouses or our boyfriends or whoever it is okay. We're constantly, even in some of our professional roles, we're carrying on the weight of other people's crap sometimes because it's just expected that we're just going to be able to carry it. And then the moment we do show a little bit of grief or sadness, it's like, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you just, it's almost like, why aren't you just taking this? How dare you feel these things, And so I think, when I think about that, I know for me, it's taking so much for me to unlearn those behaviors and unlearn, thinking that there's something wrong with showing those types of emotions. But that's taken me like, I don't know, I started therapy when I was like 20 maybe. So that's taken me like 10 years of working through this stuff. But I can only, but for some other people who may not have the time, the resources, the abilities, whatever, to do this type of work, um, they they probably, are still kind of, dealing with all these feelings, and they don't know, they don't have the space to really sit with it and talk about it and stuff like that. So I think that is what's like hard when we have these conversations, is like all of those realities play a role in how much people can grow, especially from the mental health standpoint. When we think about, like, especially the black race, or the um all the different types of black cultures that are involved in this conversation.
Yeah, I like that. 'Cause in my head, I'm just thinking like, like how sometimes maybe if we're having a protest, and how, they kind of label us immediately as rioters and dangerous, or if you see a black person who's been shot, or a black person who's doing some crime on TV, they never bring up, oh, he's suffering from mental illness. They never look for that part of us. Sometimes it seems like black people are not allowed to suffer from any mental illness. If it had to be a Caucasian person or a white person, you'd see that the first thing they'll be like, no, apparently this person is on drugs, had a tough childhood, suffering from PTSD, or suffering from this and suffering from that. I'm like, what about us? Sometimes it feels like, as black people, in a way, you're already told by the media and all of this that you're not allowed to suffer from all of this, despite everything that has happened to you. I guess, I don't know, in your head you can't suffer from anything. You can't have depression. How can a black person suffer from depression? What are you depressed about? Sometimes it makes me feel like that's the image that they give of us as black people. So I guess that the question would be, why do you think such topics are important, especially when it comes to our race and culture, mental illness topics? Why is it important? I think we'll start with Neph this time, and then go to Cynthia.
Well, just in what you said though, I'm like, just to clear up, like, even if you do have a mental health issue, it doesn't excuse you from being human being. Like, doing what, and I say that, and like, murder and all these things obviously are wrong. And so for us to see, like, I mean, how many shootings by white men have there been where they're like, oh, he's a lone wolf, he had mental health issues, and it's like, first of all, the tying like murderer and whatever to mental health people, sometimes, that creates a stigma that shouldn't be there, because there's a lot of people living with mental health issues, from depression to full-blown schizophrenia, that are not out here murdering people. um but then also it's like, like you said, like, we don't get this like grace, like, as people of color, even if we are struggling with depression or something like that, and let's say we have a bad day and we shoot up something, which I don't think that has happened really that much in history. But let's say if we did do that, I think they would still find reasons to be like, oh well, let's list off all the reasons why they deserve to die. So I think, you saying that, it made me think about that too. It's not like having a mental health issue is an excuse, to be like, yeah, let me go on a rampage and hurt other people. So I just wanted to clarify that. I low key forgot your question as well. Oh, the importance of talking about this.
No,
I was like,
like that, because I think so many people will feel a bit better, that doesn't mean if I have a mental illness that everybody should think that I'm a threat,
yeah,
and which is very important
exactly.
to think about mental health.
Yeah,
That if a person is suffering from mental illness, they're not a threat. They're not out there to kill anybody or to harm anybody. They're not weird. They're not mad. They just have a medical condition. And I think that I love
exactly.
that you clarified that for us.
Yeah, because I mean, I do know, I have met, like, there was one person I met that was like a full blown, like, I think, is it sociopath or whatever, Cynthia? I forget the DSM-5. But the point is, like, he was okay with like murdering people, and as we were like doing his, because we had to do assessments. I worked as a screener, so we had to give them assessments so that they could meet with their doctor. I didn't have to give the assessment, but my coworker did, and he was kind of like describing how, like, he was, open to, like, murdering somebody, and then he was saying how, like, thank god my my ex-girlfriend got away. Like, he was saying stuff that I was just like, this is the stuff of nightmares, you know? And so yes, those people do exist, and luckily with his situation, he recognized like he was hearing voices telling him to hurt people and hurt himself, so he got help. So I think, unfortunately that stuff does happen and we can't avoid it, right? But I think it is important, even when we talk about talking about this in the Black community, which I think was your question. um like, we do have to talk about like the myths and the realities of mental health, because I think sometimes we focus so much on the myths that we don't actually go and get the help that we need. And I know, like, particularly I think about even with my family structure, um especially because we were immigrants, I think a lot of it out of protection. um they were like, don't talk about stuff, don't say anything. And I understood why, out of protection, it would have been wise to not like invite, outside people in sometimes. But I think one of the things that um, that kind of mindset of like not talking to outside people um, didn't help me with is like, sometimes in your home space, even if your parents love you and they do a good job in a lot of other areas, if they're not good at like providing like a good emotional space sometimes, which my parents, because they're working sometimes, they couldn't do that. It can still bring up things in you that you need to work through and process. And so thank God I ignored them on that, and I started like learning how to invite, mentors in, and eventually I went to therapy and I learned to talk outside of the home. But I know a lot of people, they could be even going through really bad things like abuse and all these different things, and or they have like really hard mental health things going on. um and because of this stigma around, oh, we don't talk about stuff, um they can be trapped in whatever they're dealing with because they don't feel like they have the freedom to go and have those conversations with the people that they need to talk to. So I think, you know that's why for me, I've been very open with talking about, going to therapy, talking about my mental health concerns and things like that. Just because I don't want people to feel like um there's something wrong with doing that. Especially, I know for me, since I do the work of like with organizing and anti-racism, there's some days that like I need to talk to my therapist because I'm like, I had to listen to or watch so much trauma, or like, I was like, if I don't process this with somebody, like, it's very easy for me to just be sad. And especially because I know myself, I'm a very empathetic person. So you can tell me a story about something that happened to you, and I feel everybody's feelings. It helps me a lot with like being a therapist and doing other things. But like, I'm still feeling everybody's feelings. So if I'm not very cautious and aware of that, and make sure that I'm creating spaces, especially in therapy, to talk about that stuff, it's very easy for me myself to be very sad and have a hard time. So yeah, so I had to work through like, okay, yes, these myths or these feelings about therapy and mental health may exist in my system, but it's so important for me to talk about this because I know if I'm not doing that, like, it's going to be worse for me in the long run than it is for me to like, let's say even make my parents happy in the short run. So I think that was why one of the reasons why I was like, I need to be talking about mental health more, and I want to give other, especially Black people, the freedom to be like, hey, this doesn't have to be a white people thing, this doesn't make you crazy. Like, it's okay to see someone, even if it's like, every other week for a tune up, like whatever you decide with your therapist, like it's okay to be, processing stuff with somebody else. And I think it also just helps because you have an unbiased voice too, because I know if I tell, there's some friends, if I tell them stuff, they're ready to fight for me, and I don't mind that. I'm like, yeah, get mad for me. I don't, but at the same time, like sometimes it just helps for me to not feel riled up and worried about like, oh no, how's my friend gonna react? Is she gonna go after this person? And I could just freely tell my therapist, and he's just like, okay, I'm sorry that was hard. Like, he'll validate my feelings, and then he'll help me work through possible solutions in like a way that's productive. Um, And sometimes I have friends that can do that too, but I think there's something about doing that with a therapist that's also great. Um, so yeah, I think I'll end there and let Cynthia answer for her part of this.
Yeah,
All right, thank you so much. You know the question, or you want me to help you refresh it just in case?
yes, please.
So the question was, in your opinion, why do you think the topic of mental health is important in our race and culture?
Yes, now I remember. Yeah, I think actually kind of reflecting on the thoughts that have already come up, I think it's just important to normalize mental health because, I know that there was a stat that came out like years ago specific to anxiety in the United States. 25% of adults have an anxiety disorder, have symptoms that could be classified as an anxiety disorder. And I think that's even under reporting. I think a lot more people at some point in time in their life will have a challenge or something that has to do with mental health. And the more we normalize it, specifically in our community, the more people will not feel as though it is something that they should be ashamed about. I know that even something as that might something that's kind of more normalized, like having relational issues, like issues in your relationships with your family, or issues in your relationship with your peers or husband, boy, any type of partnership or anything like that. That's kind of been normalized. It's like, oh yeah, we're just going through it, or like it's a tough time. That dysfunction has been normalized for a lot of communities. And that's something that you can go to therapy too. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that like you're depressed or that you have anger issues. I think therapy, normalizing it for things that don't have to do with the individual, but that can be done with groups, is also very important because I think, like Neff mentioned, having like a third party observer provide their expertise and be an unconditional source of support in the way that can help you kind of meet your goals is very helpful. I hope with time, as it becomes more normalized in our community, it's going to be something that people don't think of it like as a white people thing. It's a people thing.
I love that you said it's not going to be seen as a white people thing, but a people thing, which is so deep and so good. I see nephew unmuted yourself. You wanted to add something?
Well, I was gonna say, I when Cynthia was speaking, it also just reminded me of like just the stuff that gets normalized when we're not talking about it. So, for example, I know I didn't really watch the whole thing, but Malcolm and Marie, and how like a lot of people have said that their relationship is toxic, that movie, because how the man and the woman are talking and treating each other. Um, it just reminded me of like how a lot of times like that kind of toxic behavior, especially in the Black community, is normalized, and people are like, oh my god, like, couple goals and whatever, and you're just like, no, if both of them went to therapy, yes, they can be couple goals and we can to root for them, but like because of how toxic and all this gaslighting and this verbal abuse, all the stuff that you see in a lot of these relationships that we're saying are goals, we end up continuing to see generations of like broken families or just broken relationships, and because we're just basically repeating the things that we see. So I think that's something that I thought of too, of just like how important it is, just so that we can have better relationships with each other and our partners and things like that, to just go to therapy so that you can work through the stuff that's keeping you from actually loving people in like a healthy way. So that's all I was thinking.
Yeah, and like before we go to our last question, I was just thinking about the media. Do you think the media has any impact on how we deal with mental health and mental illnesses, in the sense of how we are shown, I guess, the images of Black people that we see? If you watch music videos, you see that you can easily drown off your pain by drinking alcohol or smoking, all that hatred or pain or anything that you're feeling away. We watch movies and we normalize probably abuse in Black communities. So in a way, there's certain patterns that I guess for me sometimes is normalized for Black people. You'd be like, oh yeah, because if you've been a young person, if you've been watching this repeatedly, and it's there constantly. When they talk about a Black person, there's just this image that comes up. Do you think sometimes, one way or another, that the media has impacted us and has affected how we view mental illness and mental health in our communities, and not just how we view it, but also how we handle and deal with our emotions, or if we're going through any challenges at all? So I don't know who wants to go first with this one. Cynthia said Neph.
Well, I mean, there's multiple thoughts on this, but I do think like sometimes it can play a role in a good way and sometimes not so much, because there is some art and music out there where, the artists are talking about mental health, especially like for an example, like rap music. There are a lot of rappers that are talking about their feelings, they're talking about their struggles. Yes, it may include using substance use sometimes, but I think the thing about our music and our art sometimes is we're talking about our lived experiences. It's not that, we're glamorizing like, drug use or selling drugs or whatever it is. Sometimes it's just they're talking about it because that's what they grew up in. And so part of them healing is expressing the things that they saw or talking about. So I think that's one hand. But then also I've seen, like, especially even as of late, there's a lot of shows where they're showing Black people going to therapy, and the therapist isn't being like crazy. They're actually like helping the person work through stuff. And that's been encouraging. Like, I think I don't know if you watch this, Rosette, but I know me and Cynthia watch Insecure sometimes. It's a show that's on HBO. Um, and as part of one of the character arcs, like one of the characters is going to therapy, and sometimes like she's very open in there. Most of the times we're like, girl, you have way more to share, but at least like she's making some steps of like, okay, I need to go to therapy, I need to talk this out, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think because there are a lot of Black shows that are openly being like, go to therapy, this is good for you. And even the same actress, her name is Yvonne Orji. She and her one of her close friends, Love Jai, they both have like a podcast too where they've talked about openly like, hey, I've gone to therapy, I still see my therapist, we have a standing meeting, like, so they're openly talking about that. And because they are, I think that's also been encouraging people. So I say, short answer is like there's a yes and type of thing where like, yes, sometimes like people can take, some of these shows and these songs and maybe not make the best decisions for their mental health. But at the same time, I've also heard where these shows and these songs have been helpful for people in terms of like, oh, wow, I didn't know I was dealing with X, Y, and Z. But after listening to or watching this, like I took my butt to a therapist and I started dealing with my mental health. So I think it depends on the person really. Um, so I think like that's where I'm at with that. But I don't know if Cynthia has other thoughts, but I think that's what really resonated with me on that.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Neff said, and I think that what I would hope to see is it becoming more becoming more popular. Just seeing people talk about mental health in that context, because similarly, you see people either create media or create art that has to do with their lived experiences, where they talk about some of these risky behaviors that they've done to be able to cope with what they've experienced. A lot of the times too, especially these people are now in the upper class, the top 1%, because of the money that they've made from their art. Hopefully at that point then they will be able to go to therapy or have gotten services at some point, and I hope that would be something that could also show up in their art as their lived experiences presently, because I think sometimes one thing that I've noticed too is that a lot of the art that's getting created, especially with I'm not to go into it, but like mumble rappers and stuff like that, that I think that is really being um, pushed to Generation Z and just like younger folk, is a lot of perpetuation of stereotypes, that while they may be lived experiences, I also see them being perpetuation of stereotypes for white consumption that also creates a negative image of Black people for white people who are enjoying that media too. And that also creates a stereotype of like, well, they've had this experience. That's just how life is for them. So they don't need therapy. And I think that also kind of creates a cycle, if that makes sense too. So I just hope that, mental health and concerns about that becomes more popularized in music specifically, like we see it in like movies and TV shows too. Because I think it's helpful to normalize it in that way.
Yeah, I think this just leads us to our last question. Um, as we're just talking about how, I guess, when we're talking about all these issues, how can we make sure that this topic is effective, that we make it an effective way, or look for solutions? What is the way out for us? If we can look for a solution, I think some people listening probably in their heads would think, okay, this is what is happening in our community, what's the way forward? Because in my head I'm just thinking, as a Black woman, currently I'm going house, I'm looking for a house, and the first thing I told the lady who was helping me, she's like, oh, so what are you looking for? I'm like, well, the first thing I'm looking for is a place that will be safe for a single Black lady. I that was the first thing I told her. If you know that this place, a single Black lady can live in that place, then I would feel fine. That just goes to show you that that's how much it impacts me, because I have to think every movement of mine is is done with that. Like, okay, you're going to this area, are you sure it's safe? Are you sure you can go there alone? Do you need to go there with a person? So I'm constantly living with it. So how do we make sure that we start addressing it? Because I think if we don't address it, we might go crazy one of these days, because it's becoming part of our lifestyle. PTSD, looking behind your shoulder. Sometimes I pass cops and I'm like, oh my goodness, I hope I don't get stopped. I hope or you're driving and you see somebody get stopped and you're like, oh my goodness, I hope it ends in a good way. So all these things stick with you. So I guess it would be, how can we work to be more effective in addressing mental health issues within our communities and our race? So I think we'll start with Cynthia and then we'll go to Neph.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question too, and kind of going into some of the work that I've done. I think for adults, because I mainly work with kids, but I think for adults, it's kind of starting within your own sphere of influence. So if you know that mental health is something that's important to you, not to have it be important to you alone. Like talk about it with others. Be kind of vulnerable in the sense to share it and normalize it and make it seem like, yeah, I saw my therapist on Thursday, and then the weather is, it's sunny. Just like trying to normalize it with the people who you talk to. You don't have to get on a stage and blast it to, everyone that, that's something that you do if you don't feel comfortable doing that. But just feeling open to talk about it with the people of your closest sphere of influence, because people are more likely to do things that they've never done before if they know someone who's done it, not because they saw, maybe if they saw some influencer do it, maybe if they saw some advert or something talking about it, but if like, yo, my best friend goes to therapy and she says it's great, I'll be more likely to go because I know her and I trust her judgment and things like that. I think kind of thinking on a broader, like more programmatic sense is to involve the community, like not to come in with an intervention or some type of curriculum or something that hasn't had community stakeholders have an eye on and be part of the development. I think kind of looking at more community-based work is like working with the community to address the needs of the community in areas where in places that it would be the most feasible for access. Because I think the biggest thing is mental health access. Like we could all want therapy, but if nobody can afford it, then we're all kind of just looking at each other wanting therapy. So trying to improve access, but that's a whole other conversation.
All right, she brought out the big guns, Neph. What do you have to say?
No, I was gonna say, yeah, that's definitely a whole nother conversation. Because I know even with me too, I'm hoping, like, I'm working to eventually become a therapist, and even thinking through like how can we provide access is like a big part. But for me, I would say too, like, it's just being unapologetic about this. Because I know there's a few times like it kind of came up in even in my house, or even with my family, I should say, that I've gone to therapy, and my aunt was kind of like, what do you mean? And I know, like, even though it is an uncomfortable conversation, I'm like, yep, I go. Like, I have to be honest and be like, yeah, I go. And part of it is so that I'm not like snapping at people, especially, like we talked about, all the trauma that we have to endure on a daily basis, sometimes just being Black. um it's hard to like go through that, and not have a space or create space for like, grieving or lamenting, talking about it, creating joy. Like if you're not, having the tools and the things that you need to do better, or to cope better, I guess, or and even cope in like a healthy way. It's all this, violence and sadness. It will destroy you at some point, or you just become callous to everything. So, um, I know for me, especially working with organizing and working with anti-racism, like it's a daily work for me to really let myself feel stuff and like not let myself become callous. And especially for me as a person of faith too, that's important to me to not let myself get to the point where I'm so callous that I become the people that are hurting me. And so that's for me, that's what therapy has been able to do. So that's part of why I'm like, look, I'm unapologetic about this. Like even to the point where like every Friday, well, Central Time it's 12, but for me it's 1 o'clock. But every Friday at that time is my therapy session. I never move it. Unless like there's something that comes up with him or maybe me as like an emergency, we don't move it because for me, that's something that I will not budge on. And so I think it's, even with this, it's like be unapologetic and make sure it's a priority. And I think as you're doing that too, the people around you will notice like, hey, like you seem to be handling things well, like, or you seem to be in a really good place. What are you doing? And I think that also can spark conversation. So I know with me, because I've been going to therapy and I've been open about it. I've had some friends too that they started going to therapy. And then their friends started going to therapy. So like Cynthia said, like if your friends notice like you've been going to therapy and you're like openly talking about it and you're not, there's no shame, there's no whatever, they'll start doing that stuff too. And especially in the Black community, I think if we are, talking to each other about going to therapy and we're making it normal and we're not treating it like, are you okay? Like, what's going on? Like, more people will be willing to do that work. And I think it'll make us healthier for it, honestly. Even though there are some days where I leave therapy and I'm just like, whew, I did not want to talk about that. This was rough. But in the long run, it's been really good. So I don't know. I just encourage people to do it. Is even if you have some weeks where you're like, I never want to do this again, just go back. So yeah, it's me.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we've come actually to the end of our session for today, but I really enjoyed the conversation and just the perspective that both of you had, and knowing that both of you are actually professionals in this field. I really love that we had that. But I also want to encourage everybody who listened to us and who watched us not to just after listening to us and say, okay, that's it. Keep the work going. I think just like both of you have said, it's by us talking, by us giving it value, that other people will see the value in talking about mental health and addressing the stigma that surrounds it. So if you are listening to us, try to speak to more people about it. Try to look for a way in which you can also be a bit more helpful, a bit more loving, a bit more ray of a ray of hope, so to say, to anybody who's going through anything tough, because you never know who is going through what. You might see somebody smiling, but they might be dying inside. So try to be a bit kinder. And if you are going through anything, I'm going to keep saying this every time when we have the end. If you are going through any challenges, we're going to link the resources to this video for you. Just know that you are not alone. There is a road to recovery. There is a way out of whatever it is that you're going through, and your life matters, and you have so many people out there who love you. So reach out to people, look for a person to speak to, look for friends, and we're here. We're here as well if you want to reach out to us. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night, and thank you so much to our beautiful panelists. Have a good night too.